The chipped formica of the desk felt colder than I expected. That was the first thing. I'd pictured something industrial, maybe stainless steel, something that felt actively cleaned. This felt like a diner from the 70s that hadn't been updated since. I ran a hand over the surface, leaving a faint drag mark in a film of something sticky. The job description hadn't mentioned anything about the aesthetics, obviously, but I'd built this picture in my head of crisp efficiency, of a place where things worked, a place that justified the pay, at least enough to keep the bank from sending another letter. The room itself was a long rectangle, split in two by the counter. Behind me, the inspection bays, 3 of them, each with a metal detector arch and a row of chairs bolted to the floor. Ahead, the waiting area, currently empty. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the sound a high-pitched whine that settled right behind my eyes. It smelled like stale coffee and something else disinfectant, maybe but a cheap industrial version. Not the lemon-fresh kind you get in a doctor's office. More like a hospital bathroom. The air felt heavy, almost damp, despite the humming of the ventilation unit in the corner. Old man Harvey, the guy who'd shown me around, hadn't said much beyond the basics. He swiped my security card, pointed out the break room, the bathrooms, the location of the emergency exits. He'd been chewing gum, rhythmically, almost violently. Didn't offer me a bottle of water, didn't ask if I had any questions. Just handed me a manila envelope with the logbook and a slip of paper. Rules, he'd said, then turned and walked away. Just walked away. I figured it was just a standard procedure thing. Liability, covering their bases. I'd read similar things in training for other temp jobs. I'd almost asked him about the schedule, about whether I could swap shifts next week when Ren had that school play, but he was already halfway down the corridor. Best not to bother him, I thought. Just get the job done. Keep my head down. The slip of paper contained a list, typed in a Courier New font that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. 1. Internal observation windows between rooms may not be used after 10 p.m. Cover them from your side before that time. 2. If a security camera goes offline, note it in the log, but do not attempt to diagnose or repair it yourself. Work as if it is still recording. 3. If someone is in the public waiting area after closing time, do not approach them alone. Alert a coworker first. If no coworker is available, do not approach. 4. All window shades in the north-facing office must be drawn before 8 p.m. If you arrive after that time and any are open, close them. Do not look outside before closing them. 5. Do not wear any fragrance, perfume, cologne, scented lotion on the premises. Wear only unscented products. 6. Any unusual event requiring a report must be witnessed by at least one other person. A report filed by a lone witness goes into the secondary log, not the primary. 7. If your supervisor gives you a verbal instruction that contradicts the written guidelines, follow the written guidelines. Do not confront, simply comply with what is written. 8. Secure the loading dock before dark. If you arrive and it is already secured, do not open it to verify the interior. Log that it was pre-secured and move on. 9. Never count aloud on the premises. All counting inventory, rooms, people must be done silently. Written tallies are acceptable. 10. If you find an erased or overwritten entry in the log, note its location in your own entry. Do not attempt to read the original. Do not ask who wrote it. I read through them again. Weird. Just weird. The window thing felt particularly odd, like someone had a very specific phobia, probably some old-timer who believed in bad omens. I chuckled to myself. This place was going to be interesting, at least, a little eccentric, a little backwards, but it paid the bills, and that was all that mattered. I pictured Opal having a proper Christmas this year, no more worrying about whether we could afford new winter coats for the kids. I glanced at the clock, 11:52 p.m. Almost time to start my rounds. Harvey had said the observation windows were in the hallway behind the inspection bays. I stood and stretched, a pop echoing in my lower back. I whistled a few bars of an old tune my dad used to like, just to loosen up. I walked towards the hallway, already mentally checking off the items on my list: logbook, pen, flashlight, and the windows. I'd cover them at 10, just to get it over with. No need to tempt fate, even if I didn't believe in fate. It was just easier to comply. As I neared the hallway, I noticed a faint draft, a coolness that wasn't accounted for by the ventilation. It wasn't unpleasant, just unexpected. I paused, listening. The hum of the lights, the distant thrum of traffic on the highway. Nothing else. I reached for the light switch at the hallway entrance and flipped it on. The fluorescent tubes flickered for a moment, then settled into a steady, cold glow, and that's when I saw that one of the windows, the one furthest down the hall, was already covered. With something dark, something that wasn't a standard issue blind. I decided to start with the bathrooms. Harvey hadn't mentioned anything about checking them during rounds, but it seemed like a good idea. Just to make sure everything was functioning, no vandalism, that sort of thing. It felt proactive, like I was actually contributing, not just marking time until sunrise. The women's room was small, tiled in a sickly pale green. The automatic hand dryer whirred for an unnecessarily long time after I left. It was a hollow, echoing sound. The men's room was similar, but smelled faintly of bleach. I checked the soap dispensers, flushed the toilets, and made a quick visual inspection of the stalls. Nothing out of the ordinary. The fluorescent lights in the bathrooms had that same high-pitched buzz as the ones in the main room, but it was somehow more pronounced in the enclosed space. It made the back of my teeth ache. I found myself unconsciously tightening my jaw, trying to block it out. I started whistling again, a little off-key. It was a fragment of that old tune my dad loved. It helped a little. I checked the time, 1:17 a.m. Still a long stretch to go. After the bathrooms, I moved on to the break room. It was exactly as Harvey had left it. A chipped formica table, 4 mismatched chairs, a coffee machine that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a decade. A half-empty box of stale donuts sat on the counter, covered in a thin film of dust. I didn't touch them. I glanced at the small window overlooking the parking lot. It was empty. The security camera above it was blinking green, which, according to Harvey, meant it was functioning. I was trying to remember if Opal had mentioned anything about needing milk. I always forgot to ask these things. She usually left a list on the fridge, but I hadn't seen a list in a couple of weeks. She was good at handling things, though. She always was. I just wanted to take some of the load off, to maybe surprise her with something she needed. It wasn't about the milk, really. It was about showing her I was thinking about her, about the kids, about everything. I whistled a little louder, trying to focus on the melody. That's when I remembered the windows. The observation windows. I'd been so focused on the bathrooms and the break room, on trying to remember the grocery list, that I'd completely forgotten about them. I checked my watch again. 1:23 a.m. Well past 10 o'clock. I hadn't covered a single one. A little prickle of annoyance ran down my spine. I'd been so careful to follow the rules, to make a good impression, and I'd already messed up something simple. It wasn't a big deal, I told myself. Just cover them now. No harm done. Probably just a precaution against someone peering in and causing trouble. I pictured teenagers messing around, trying to spook the officer on duty. I started walking back down the hallway towards the row of windows. As I passed the last inspection bay, I glanced idly through the window furthest down. The one I'd noticed was already covered earlier, but now it wasn't covered. The dark material had been pulled aside, leaving a rectangular patch of clear glass, and the room on the other side was dark. Completely, utterly dark. Not just dim, not just shadowed. It was as if the light had been actively absorbed. A wave of nausea hit me, a cold, clammy sweat breaking out on my forehead. I didn't think. I didn't analyze, I just reacted. I moved quickly, almost stumbling, and reached for the small lever that controlled the window covering. I pulled it down. The dark material slid into place with a soft thunk. I didn't look back. I didn't linger. I didn't even breathe until my hand was clear of the mechanism. The darkness beyond the glass, it wasn't right. It wasn't the darkness of an empty room. It was something else. I shook my head, trying to dispel the image. It was probably just a trick of the light, a shadow playing on my eyes. Too much coffee, not enough sleep. The old building, the weird rules. It was all getting to me. I needed to calm down, to focus, but even as I told myself that, I knew it wasn't true. I logged the incident, a brief, factual entry. Window 3 uncovered, secured at 1:25 a.m. I didn't mention the darkness. I didn't mention the feeling of wrongness that had settled in my stomach. I just logged the fact that the window had been uncovered and I had covered it again. And I made a mental note to check every single one of those windows, meticulously on every single round from now on. I had a feeling I wouldn't be forgetting them again. I was restocking the supply closet. Not a glamorous task, but someone had to do it. Harvey had a system, of course. Everything had its place, labeled with that faded, blocky handwriting of his. Gloves, disinfectant wipes, spare flashlight batteries, those plastic evidence bags all neatly arranged on the shelves. It was comforting, the order of it all. A small pocket of control in a building that was increasingly feeling unsettled. The smell in the closet was a mix of cleaning fluid and something older, something like dust and cardboard. It wasn't unpleasant, just present. I was sorting through a box of spare pens, checking for ones that had dried out, when I started whistling again, the same tune. It was automatic now, a nervous habit. I realized I hadn't really thought about my dad in a few weeks, not consciously. Just the whistle, surfacing when I was stressed or trying to focus. It was a silly little thing, but it grounded me. I finished with the pens, moved on to the flashlight batteries. The ones in the duty flashlights were all relatively new, but it was good to know there were spares. I made a mental note to check the expiration dates on these, just to be thorough. I glanced around the closet, satisfied with my progress. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small win in a long day. That's when I noticed it. The monitor in the corner of the supply closet, the one displaying the feed from camera 3, it was blank. Just a static gray screen. I frowned. That wasn't right. Harvey had made a point of showing me each camera during the walkthrough, emphasizing their importance. He'd said camera 3 covered the long corridor leading to the loading dock, the one I walked down every hour on my rounds. Good sight lines, he'd said. Catches everything. I tapped the screen with my finger. Nothing. I checked the power cord, made sure it was securely plugged in. Still nothing. A small, insistent voice in the back of my head reminded me of the list of rules. Harvey hadn't gone into a lot of detail, just handed me a single sheet of paper with a few terse instructions. And there was something about cameras, something about what to do if one went down. I racked my brain, trying to recall the exact wording. Something about not trying to fix it yourself, just log it. It was probably a simple power surge, I thought, or a faulty cable. Something easily fixed. But then I remembered the way Harvey had said it, the way he'd looked at me when he'd gone through the rules. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. And the rule fragment was coming back to me now, hazy and incomplete. If a camera fails, log it. Do not attempt repair. It felt stronger in my memory than I expected. I could probably just quickly check the connection box, reset the camera. It would take 5 minutes, tops. No one would know. I started to turn towards the door, ready to ignore the rule and just get it fixed. It was common sense. What harm could it do? But then, just as I was about to move, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic clicking sound coming from somewhere down the corridor. It wasn't loud, barely audible above the hum of the ventilation system, but it was there. A distinct, deliberate clicking, like someone snapping their fingers or tapping a fingernail against a hard surface. I froze. The clicking stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening intently. Nothing. Just the hum of the ventilation. I glanced at the blank monitor again. My hand, halfway to the door, slowly lowered. The clicking hadn't sounded like a mechanical malfunction. It had sounded intentional. I sighed. I grabbed the logbook from the shelf and carefully recorded the incident. Camera 3 offline, reported at 2:42 a.m. No attempt at repair made. I didn't mention the clicking, I didn't mention the feeling that had washed over me, a cold wave of unease. I simply logged the fact that the camera was down. As I closed the logbook, I noticed something else, a faint, almost imperceptible scent in the air. Not the usual cleaning fluid or dust, something else, something metallic, not like iron or steel, but older, like old coins or blood. I pressed my lips together, trying to dispel the image. It was my imagination, I told myself. Just my imagination. But I knew with a growing certainty that things were starting to shift, and that camera 3 being offline wasn't just a technical glitch. I made a note to avoid that corridor on my next round, just in case, and I started to walk a little faster. I was counting the change in the donation box. It was mostly small bills, 1s and 5s, a few quarters and dimes. Not much, but every bit helped, I supposed. Opal said the checkpoint always felt a little sad, like a place people pass through rather than a destination. She'd suggested putting a donation box for a local animal shelter on the counter, saying it might make the place feel a little warmer. It hadn't. Not really. People mostly ignored it. The fluorescent lights hummed, a steady, irritating drone. I'd asked Harvey about getting them replaced months ago, but he just shrugged and said it wasn't in the budget. Everything wasn't in the budget. The whole place felt like it was being held together with duct tape and wishful thinking. I emptied the box into a plastic bag, made a quick note in the ledger, and then started wiping down the counter with a disinfectant spray. It smelled like pine, a cheap imitation of something real. I glanced up, checking the clock. 2:57 a.m., nearly done with the closing procedures, just the final check of the waiting area, lock up the outer doors, and then I could head home. Sarah would be asleep, thankfully. I hated leaving her alone with a worry. Even a good night's sleep didn't erase the lines around her eyes. That's when I saw him. Or her. It was hard to tell in the dim light. A figure seated in one of the molded plastic chairs in the waiting area. Perfectly still, facing forward. I hadn't noticed anyone come in. The outer doors hadn't chimed, and the inner door, the one leading directly into the waiting area, was supposed to be locked automatically after 11. I distinctly remembered checking it during my last round. For a moment, I just stared. Maybe it was someone who'd gotten here just before closing and had fallen asleep. A truck driver waiting for his paperwork to clear. But something felt off. The figure wasn't moving, not even a twitch, and the lighting in that area was terrible, casting long, distorted shadows. Then I remembered Harvey's list. I sifted through the memory, trying to recall the exact wording. Something about people remaining in the waiting area after hours. Something about not approaching them alone. If someone is in the public waiting area after closing time, do not approach them alone. Alert a coworker first. If no coworker is available, do not approach. It wasn't a detailed instruction, just a warning, a vague, unsettling warning. Honestly, it sounded a little paranoid. Probably just a leftover rule from some incident years ago. Someone trying to sleep off a bender, maybe. I could just go over there, politely ask them if they needed help. See if they were all right. It was probably nothing, but the rule, the way Harvey had emphasized the do not approach part. He'd said it with a flat affect, no inflection, but the weight of it had still sunk in. And I was alone, completely alone. Agnes wasn't due back until 6 a.m. I told myself I was being silly, letting my imagination run wild. It was just a person, a tired traveler. But I didn't move. I didn't even take a step towards the waiting area. Instead, I finished wiping down the counter, then moved to the outer doors, double-checking the locks. I secured the side entrance and the employee access door. Each click of the deadbolts felt strangely loud in the quiet building. I avoided looking back at the waiting area. I didn't want to see if the figure was still there. I didn't want to know. I finished the closing checklist, initialed the form, and then turned off the lights in the main lobby. The building was dark now, except for the emergency exit signs glowing a sickly green. As I walked towards my car, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. A feeling of being watched. I didn't look back. I started the engine, put the car in reverse, and pulled out of the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, I caught a fleeting glimpse of the waiting area. It was dark and empty, or at least it appeared to be. I couldn't be sure. I drove faster, wanting to put as much distance as possible between myself and that checkpoint. I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to mention this to anyone. Not Sarah, not Opal, not even Agnes. They'd think I was losing it. And maybe I was. But the image of that still figure seated in the darkness was burned into my mind. And I knew with a growing dread that it wasn't going to be easy to forget. I also knew I'd be checking that inner door twice on my next shift, and I'd be making a detour around the waiting area, no matter what. I spent 20 minutes recalibrating the metal detector. It had been acting up all week, giving false positives on empty trays. Old machine, I guess. Everything here was old. Even the coffee tasted like it had been brewed during the Carter administration. I methodically adjusted the sensitivity, ran a test with a handful of keys, then a spare belt buckle. Finally, it seemed stable. Not perfect, but stable enough to not flag every single driver coming through. It was nearly 7:30. Later than I usually got in. Sarah had a doctor's appointment for Leo, something about a persistent cough. I ended up driving him, then picking up Ren from Cal's. Cal was good with the kids, always willing to help, but it meant I was scrambling to get here on time. The extra money was worth it, though. It had to be. The foreclosure notice was still taped to the fridge, a cheerful yellow against the stainless steel. It felt like a threat, even when I wasn't looking at it. I finished the calibration log, initialed it, and then did a quick walkthrough of the inspection booths. Everything seemed normal. The usual clutter of paperwork, empty coffee cups, a stray pen. I checked the monitors. Camera 1 and 2 were clear. Camera 3 was still out. That static gray screen was starting to get on my nerves. I'd reported it, of course, twice. But maintenance was always backed up. Prioritize essential systems, they'd said. I didn't feel particularly non-essential, sitting here alone, guarding the border. Then I remembered the windows, the large panoramic windows overlooking the parking lot and the fields beyond. Harvey's list. I'd glanced at it again before leaving, trying to commit everything to memory. It was a new one, I was sure of it. Something about shades. All window shades in the inspection area must be drawn before 8 p.m. I remembered the sharpness of Harvey's tone when he'd explained it. No exceptions, Kieran, before 8, and don't ask why. It was 7:45. I walked along the row of windows, checking each shade. The first 2 were down, as they should be. The third was halfway up, and the fourth and the fifth. 3 of them were open to the darkening sky. It wasn't a breeze that had lifted them. I was certain of that. There hadn't been a breeze all day. I told myself it was just someone being careless, a new hire maybe who hadn't read the memo, or someone who'd forgotten. It happened. People were forgetful. I started pulling the cords, lowering the shades one by one. I turned my back to the windows as I did it, focusing on the texture of the cord in my hand, the smooth plastic of the shade mechanism. I didn't want to look outside. Not yet. The rule had been specific. Do not look outside before closing them. I felt a little ridiculous, honestly. It was just a window shade. The last shade was stubborn, the cord was frayed, and it took a couple of hard pulls to get it down. As it descended, I glanced up, instinctively. I didn't mean to. It was just reflex. The parking lot was mostly empty, as it should be. A couple of semi-trucks, a border patrol vehicle. Then, parked near the far edge, angled slightly differently than the others, was a car I didn't recognize. A dark sedan, maybe a Ford Taurus. I was almost certain it hadn't been there when I'd pulled in. I probably just hadn't noticed, I reasoned. It was getting dark, and my mind was still preoccupied with Leo and Ren, and the looming possibility of losing the house. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. I finished lowering the last shade, a little too quickly, and stepped back. The room was dim now, the light filtered through the heavy fabric. I ran my hand over my face, feeling the stubble on my chin. I hadn't shaved this morning. I was tired. Just tired. I walked back to the metal detector, needing something to focus on, something concrete. I started running another diagnostic, checking the calibration again. Everything seemed to be in order, but I couldn't shake the image of that car. It was probably nothing, absolutely nothing but the way it was positioned, and the fact that I was sure it hadn't been there before. I went back to the windows, not to check the shades. They were all down now, but to look again at the parking lot. The sedan was still there. And now, something else caught my eye. A flicker of movement near the tree line at the edge of the field. Just a glimpse, gone before I could focus on it. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the darkness. The static on camera 3 seemed louder now, a persistent hiss that filled the room. I felt a tightening in my chest, not quite pain, but a definite constriction. I started whistling, a nervous habit I hadn't realized I still had. It was a tuneless, repetitive melody, something my father used to do when he was working on his car. I needed to call Agnes, ask her to come in early. I couldn't explain why. Not yet. I just needed another set of eyes, another person here. I reached for the phone but then stopped. What would I say? There's a car I don't recognize, and I think I saw something move in the field. They'd think I was losing it, just like Sarah would. I lowered my hand. I wouldn't call anyone. Not yet. I'd just finish my shift, keep a close watch on the monitors, and hope nothing happened. But as I turned away from the windows, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that something had happened. And that seeing that car, even for a moment, had changed things. I checked the inner door lock 3 times before returning to the metal detector. I was inventorying the first aid kits. It wasn't a scheduled task. Not exactly, more like something to do with my hands, something that felt useful. Each kit was the same, bandages, antiseptic wipes, burn cream, a triangular sling. I checked the expiration dates on everything, making a little note on the inventory sheet. It was meticulous work, the kind of thing that could occupy my mind, if only for a little while. It was calming. The kits were stored in a small supply room just off the main inspection area. It smelled faintly of plastic and disinfectant, a sterile scent that was reassuring. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, a constant, unwavering drone. I could hear the static from camera 3 leaking through the wall. It hadn't changed. Still just that gray hiss. I'd reported it, of course, but nothing had been done. They always said these things took time. Time we didn't have, apparently. I finished the last kit and stacked them neatly on the shelf. My skin felt dry, itchy. I scratched at my forearm, then remembered the lotion. I'd used the new sandalwood lotion this morning, after my shower. Sarah had gotten it for me for my birthday. She said I needed to take better care of my skin. It wasn't a strong scent, not really. Subtle, almost woodsy, but it was definitely there. A coldness settled in my stomach. The rule. It wasn't about windows or cameras or even people in the waiting area. It was about fragrance. Do not wear any fragrance, perfume, cologne, scented lotion on the premises. Something about a trail. Something about it being used as a map. I remembered the gist of it, feeling the panic rise. I hadn't even thought about it. I just applied lotion like I always did. It was ridiculous, of course. Lotion. It wasn't like I doused myself in cologne. It was a small amount, just enough to soothe my dry skin. It probably wasn't even noticeable. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was probably nothing, just another overreaction. I was stressed, sleep-deprived. My mind was playing tricks on me. I could wash my hands, scrub them raw with the industrial soap in the break room. That would get rid of it, right? Surely that would be enough. But even as I thought it, I knew it wouldn't. The rule hadn't mentioned washing. It hadn't specified a quantity. It was absolute. Do not wear any fragrance, and I had. I'd worn it all morning. I'd been walking around this place, smelling like sandalwood. I glanced towards the door, a sudden, irrational fear prickling at the back of my neck. I tried to listen for something, anything, but there was only the hum of the lights and the hiss of the static. I needed to check the back loading dock. I hadn't done a full perimeter check since I'd finished the inventory. It was a standard procedure, something I was supposed to do every 2 hours, but I'd been putting it off. I didn't want to leave the relative safety of the main inspection area, and now I really didn't want to. The loading dock was at the far end of the building, accessible through a narrow corridor that ran along the side. It was mostly used for deliveries, but it also served as an emergency exit. The corridor was poorly lit, and the floor was uneven. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the light switch. I really needed to check it. It was my job. But the thought of walking down that dark corridor, potentially followed, made my stomach clench. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather my courage. I had to do it. I couldn't just ignore it. I switched on the light and started walking. The bulb flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I walked quickly, almost running, trying to get it over with. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the empty corridor stretching out behind me. The loading dock was empty. The large metal door was closed and locked. I checked the security seal. It hadn't been tampered with. Relief washed over me, weak and fleeting. I was about to turn back when I noticed it, a small, almost imperceptible draft coming from the crack under the door. It wasn't cold, just different. It carried no scent, but it felt like something was on the other side. I leaned closer, pressing my ear against the metal. I could hear nothing, just the faint hum of the building. I lingered there for a moment, trying to decipher the feeling. It was like anticipation, like something was waiting. Then I remembered. I hadn't checked the break room. Dora had left her lunch in the refrigerator this morning, a container of leftover chicken salad. I had promised to bring it to her daughter Wren after my shift. Wren was allergic to peanuts, and Dora was terrified of cross-contamination. I needed to make sure the container hadn't been opened. I needed to make sure Wren wouldn't get sick. But I couldn't. Not now. Not smelling like this. I couldn't risk going near anything that might be sensitive. I couldn't risk whatever the rule was protecting against. I stood there, frozen, the image of Ren's face in my mind. I knew Dora would be frantic if I didn't deliver the lunch. But I also knew, with a growing sense of dread, that I couldn't go back inside. Not tonight. I turned and walked back down the corridor, leaving Dora's daughter and the chicken salad behind. The static on camera 3 was deafening. I was restocking the pamphlet holders. It felt normal, almost embarrassingly so. Little glossy brochures about visa requirements, duty-free allowances, agricultural restrictions. I smoothed the edges of a Know Your Rights pamphlet, making sure it sat squarely in the slot. It was a stupid detail, really. No one ever read these things. They just wanted to get across the border as quickly as possible. But it kept my hands busy. It was something to do. The fluorescent lights hummed, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. I'd been meaning to wipe down the counters, but I hadn't gotten around to it. The small tasks were the ones I managed. The big things, the perimeter checks, the camera maintenance, the uncomfortable feeling that I was being watched, those felt impossible. I glanced at camera 3. Still static, still gray. I hadn't even bothered to call maintenance. What was the point? They'd just tell me it was a glitch, a power surge. They wouldn't understand. I moved on to the pamphlets about restricted items. Weapons, narcotics, certain agricultural products, the usual. I remember thinking about Cal, the guy who used to work the early shift. He was a stickler for the rules. He'd quiz people relentlessly about whether they were bringing in more than $10,000 in cash, whether they had any fruit in their luggage. He took the job seriously. I hadn't seen Cal in a while. He'd called in sick a few weeks ago, said he had the flu. I hadn't asked about him. I didn't want to know. I finished with the pamphlets and started straightening the pens on the counter. They were all different colors, most of them dried out. People stole them all the time. I picked up a blue one, clicked it a few times. Nothing. I tossed it in the discard bin. It was quiet, too quiet. The radio was on, tuned to a local news station, but the volume was low. I could barely hear the announcer's voice. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty waiting area, bathed in the pale light of the security lamps. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow playing on the wall. I'd been working too many nights. I was tired. My vision was probably just blurry. But then I saw it again. A quick, darting shadow disappearing behind the frosted glass door that led to the secondary inspection room. It wasn't a large shadow, more like a small animal. A cat, maybe, though I couldn't imagine how a cat would get in here. And the way it moved, it wasn't quite right. It wasn't a natural movement. It was too fast, too erratic. A wave of nausea rolled over me. It wasn't the scent, not directly, but the feeling was the same. That prickling sensation on my skin, the tightness in my chest, the air seemed to thicken, to become charged. I remembered something, a fragment of the training manual. Something about reporting any unusual events, any deviations from the norm. Something about needing a witness. It came back to me, hazy and incomplete. Any unusual event requiring a report must be witnessed by at least one other person. A report filed by a lone witness. Something about it being insufficient, about the record being incomplete, about it inviting something. I couldn't recall the exact wording, but I remembered the implication. It felt important. Crucially important. I looked around the room, desperately searching for someone, anyone, but I was alone, completely and utterly alone. Helen wouldn't be here for another 6 hours. Ephraim was off tonight. Nim had called in sick with a migraine. There was no one, absolutely no one. I didn't hesitate. I didn't pause to analyze or question. I simply turned and walked away from the door. Back towards the main inspection area, back towards the relative safety of the front desk. I didn't look back. It was a purely instinctive reaction, a primal urge to put distance between myself and whatever was behind that door. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. But I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk being the sole witness to something I couldn't explain. I sat back down at my desk, my hands clammy. I opened the incident log on the computer, navigated to the secondary log, the one for unverified events. I typed a brief, factual account. Possible movement observed in secondary inspection room, no visual confirmation, no other witnesses present. I hit submit. It felt inadequate, pathetic even, like throwing a pebble into a vast, dark ocean. The static on camera 3 seemed louder now, more insistent. I glanced at the frosted glass door. Nothing, just the blank, opaque surface. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that whatever had been behind that door was still there, waiting, and that the secondary log wouldn't protect me. It wouldn't protect anyone. I reached for another pamphlet, smoothed the edges. Know your rights. The irony wasn't lost on me. I started whistling, a shaky, uneven tune, a habit I hadn't even realized I'd fallen back into. It sounded hollow in the empty room, and I knew with a growing dread that the night was far from over. I was restocking the plastic sleeves for the vehicle inspection mirrors. It was a mindless task, pulling them from the cardboard box and stacking them neatly on the shelf beneath the counter. The plastic felt cool and slick against my fingertips. It was calming in a way. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a steady, unwavering drone. I'd been at it for 15 or 20 minutes. I hadn't seen another vehicle since the long-haul trucker with the chipped thermos around 9:30. The air in the inspection bay always smelled faintly of rubber and exhaust, even with the ventilation system running full blast. It was a smell I hadn't noticed much before this job, but now it seemed to cling to everything. My clothes, my skin, the inside of my nostrils. I found myself sniffing constantly, trying to discern if the smell had changed. If it was stronger, it hadn't. Not yet. I was almost finished with the box when I heard footsteps approaching. It was Ward, my supervisor. He rarely came out to the inspection bay unless he needed something. He preferred to stay up in the main office, monitoring the cameras and generally making himself scarce. "Kieran," he said, his voice gruff, "listen, about camera 3. They're sending a tech out tomorrow morning, but tonight, just leave it off. Don't bother trying to reboot it again. It's drawing power for nothing." I nodded, already reaching for the power strip. "Sure, no problem." "And," he continued, pausing for a beat, "just forget about the windows tonight. Leave them as they are. Don't worry about covering them." My hand froze halfway to the plug. That was odd. The windows were a non-negotiable. Everything had to be covered at 10 p.m. sharp. It was in the manual, underlined twice. I remembered reading it, the crisp, bureaucratic language. All interior observation windows must be obscured from external view before 2200 hours. I glanced toward the interior observation window. It was covered, thankfully. But the others... I opened my mouth to ask, to clarify, but Ward cut me off. "Look, there's been a directive from above. Just do as I say, Kieran, tonight only. It's a security thing. Don't ask questions." He gave me a quick, dismissive wave and turned to leave. "Right," I said, my voice sounding strangely small. "Okay." He didn't respond. He just walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty bay. I stared at the power strip, my hand still hovering over the plug. Leave the windows? It didn't make sense. It felt wrong, like being asked to dismantle a safety feature. It was probably nothing, I thought. Some kind of drill, a test. Ward was just following orders. He wouldn't put me in a position to lose my job. He knew I needed this job. He knew about the house. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. It was a stupid rule anyway. This obsession with the windows. What was the harm in leaving them uncovered for a few hours? Nobody ever came out this far at night. It was just a waste of time and energy. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease that was creeping into my chest. Then, I smelled it. Not the usual rubber and exhaust, something else. Something sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit. It wasn't strong, just a faint whiff, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. The scent seemed to be coming from the direction of the uncovered windows. I hadn't noticed before, hadn't consciously registered it. The smell hadn't been here a minute ago. I glanced at my watch. 9:53 p.m., still a few minutes before the deadline, but the smell, it was growing stronger. And I remembered something else. Not a specific phrase, but a feeling, a sense of consequence that the rules weren't suggestions. That deviation wasn't tolerated. Something about following instructions, even if those instructions seemed illogical. My hand moved automatically towards the pull cords for the window shades. I didn't think. I didn't question. I just acted. I pulled the cords, lowering the shades one by one, blocking out the darkness. The sweet smell faded almost immediately. It didn't disappear entirely, but it receded, becoming a faint, lingering trace. It took less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. As I finished with the last window, I noticed something on the floor. A small, dark stain, right beneath the window I'd covered last. It hadn't been there before. It was almost black, and it smelled metallic. Not like blood, exactly. More like old pennies and something else I couldn't quite place. It was a tiny stain, easily missed, but I had seen it. It was there. I stared at it for a long moment, my throat tight. Then, I grabbed a handful of paper towels and carefully wiped it up. It came off easily, leaving no residue. But the image of it, the dark stain against the concrete floor, was burned into my mind. I folded the used paper towels, placed them in the trash, and started restocking the plastic sleeves again. My hands were cold. The humming of the fluorescent lights seemed louder now, more insistent. I didn't whistle. Not this time. I just kept stacking the plastic sleeves, trying to ignore the feeling that something, somewhere, was watching me, and that whatever it wasn't pleased. I was inventorying the emergency flares. It was mind-numbing work, checking expiration dates, making sure the casings weren't corroded. But it was something to do, something to occupy my hands, and more importantly, my head. The paperwork from the last audit was still sitting on my desk, a looming stack of red ink and potential reprimands. I needed to get ahead of it, but staring at those forms felt worse than staring into the darkness. The flares were stored in a metal cabinet in the break room, tucked away behind the chipped Formica table and the coffee maker that perpetually smelled like burnt plastic. I pulled each flare out, one by one, checking the date. Most were good, a few needed replacing. It was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint crackle of the radio tuned to static. I almost whistled, a little nervous habit, but caught myself. It felt wrong somehow, like drawing attention to myself. After the flares, I started on the first aid kits: bandages, antiseptic wipes, burn cream, the usual. I made a note to order more gauze. Helen had used the last of it patching up a scrape on her son's knee last week. She'd told me about it when she dropped off her husband Samit for his overnight transport shift. It felt like a lifetime ago. Everything did these days. I finished with the first aid kits around 9:15 p.m. The schedule called for a perimeter check next, including the loading dock. It was always the loading dock, the one thing I genuinely didn't mind doing. Fresh air, even if it smelled like diesel fumes, was better than the stale, recirculated air inside. Plus, the dock was usually quiet, empty. Just the vast, dark expanse of the border stretching out beyond the fence. The walk to the loading dock was short, maybe 50 yards. The concrete was cold under my boots, even through the thick soles. The sky was overcast, a thick blanket of gray that muted the stars. The air felt heavy, damp. I could smell the rain coming, even though it hadn't started yet. As I approached the dock, I saw it. The roll-up door was down, and a heavy-duty padlock secured it from the outside. That wasn't right. I always left it open a crack, just enough to allow for ventilation. Ward always said a little air circulation prevented mold. It was probably just him being particular, and then the memory surfaced, hazy and fragmented. Something about securing the dock before dark. A rule. Something about what happened if it wasn't. I couldn't recall the exact wording, just a sense of importance. A sense of something being contained, that opening it after dark or finding it already secured had consequences. It was probably nothing. Maybe someone from maintenance had come by earlier and secured it. Maybe it was a new procedure I hadn't been informed about. Ward hadn't mentioned anything. He rarely did. He just expected you to know, but I remembered the feeling, that prickle at the back of my neck, that the rules, even the ones that made no sense, were there for a reason. I glanced at my watch, 9:27 p.m. Still time. I could unlock it, just to check, just to make sure. It would take 2 minutes, tops, but the rule, that feeling, it was insistent, a low thrum of anxiety in my chest. It felt like a mistake, a terrible mistake, to question it. The thought of unlocking it, of disturbing whatever was inside, made my skin crawl. I opened the logbook, the plastic cover cold and smooth beneath my fingers. I found the designated page for the loading dock check. I wrote the date and time, 2,347 hours. Loading dock pre-secured, no action taken. It felt wrong, like I was shirking my duty. But the image of the dark stain on the floor from the other night flashed in my mind, and I quickly suppressed the thought. As I closed the logbook, I noticed a faint tremor in my hand. Not a shake, exactly. More like a subtle vibration. It was a new sensation, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked around, scanning the darkness. Nothing, just the wind picking up, rustling through the weeds along the fence line. I started walking back towards the main building, my boots echoing on the concrete. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air was thick with anticipation. I didn't whistle. I hadn't whistled since I'd wiped up that stain. I didn't think I would for a long time. The feeling of being watched hadn't subsided, and now it was joined by something else. A cold, creeping dread that settled deep in my bones. It wasn't a fear of what might be out there, but a fear of what I had just done, or hadn't done. Either way, I had a feeling things were about to get a lot more complicated. And the flares, the first aid kits, the meticulously organized break room, they suddenly felt incredibly, desperately inadequate. I stopped at the door and pulled my collar tighter. The air smelled like rain and something else. Something I couldn't identify but knew with a sickening certainty I wouldn't forget. The break room smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant. It always did. I was sorting through the inventory, mostly restocking paper towels and those little plastic cups for the water cooler. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something to do, something to keep my hands busy. The quiet was getting to me, not the absence of noise exactly. It was the quality of the quiet, like it was listening. I'd been at it for an hour, methodically counting each item, comparing the numbers to the manifest. Paper towels boxes of 50, 2 rolls per box. I laid them out on the counter, neatly stacked. It was a pointless task, really. We rarely ran out of anything. Ward kept a surplus of everything, just in case he said preparedness was the key to a smooth operation. I suspected he just liked having control. Still, the inventory had to be done every shift. It was in the procedures manual tucked away near the section on emergency vehicle protocols. I remembered flipping through it during my initial training, bored and already dreading the mountain of debt looming over us. Ren had been sick again that week, another round of antibiotics. The copay alone had been brutal. I got to the hand sanitizer bottles. Small pump action, the kind that smelled faintly of alcohol. A case of 24. I started counting, placing each bottle in a neat row. 1, 2, 3. I lost track somewhere around 12. Started again. 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 8. Then, without thinking, I said 9, 10, 11. My voice sounded too loud in the small room, echoing off the linoleum floor. Immediately, I felt it. A tightness in my chest, a cold prickle on my skin. It wasn't a shock, not exactly. More like a shift in the air pressure. A subtle distortion. I remembered something then, a snippet of a rule buried deep in the orientation materials. Something about not counting aloud, about assigning value to things, about consequences. I couldn't recall the exact wording, just the heavy weight of it. A prohibition, absolute and unnerving. I'd probably just been jumpy. The loading dock thing still bothered me, that feeling of having done something wrong even though I'd followed procedure to the letter. A little bit of vocalizing wasn't going to cause any problems. It was silly to think so. I continued, determined to finish the count. 12, 13, 14. I focused on the bottles, the plastic cool and smooth beneath my fingertips. 15, 16, 17. And then it happened. I distinctly remember reaching for the 18th bottle. But when I said 18, there were only 17 bottles in front of me. I froze, stared at the row of bottles, then at my hands, then back at the bottles. I hadn't moved any. I hadn't bumped the table. There was no logical explanation. I counted again, slowly, carefully. 1, 2, 3, 17, 17 bottles, but the manifest clearly stated 24, and I knew I had started with 24. A wave of nausea washed over me. It wasn't the missing bottle itself, it was the wrongness of it. The impossible subtraction. I glanced around the break room, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me. But the room was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, distorted shadows. The camera in the corner, the one that hadn't worked in days, stared blankly ahead. I could smell the disinfectant, stronger now, almost metallic. And something else, a faint sweet odor that I couldn't place. It reminded me of Wren's cough syrup, the cherry-flavored stuff she hated. I grabbed the manifest again, double-checking the numbers, 24. I went back to the storage closet, rummaging through the boxes, searching for the missing bottle. Nothing. I checked the trash can. Nothing. It was as if it had simply vanished. I felt my pulse quicken, a drumming rhythm in my ears. This was different than the loading dock, different than the shades. This wasn't just a rule being broken or a procedure being overlooked. This was a correction, something actively altering reality. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to regain control. This was ridiculous. I was tired, stressed, the pressure from the bills, the worry about Wren, it was all getting to me. I was imagining things. It was a simple mistake, I'd miscounted. But I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I hadn't. I hadn't miscounted. I finished the inventory, meticulously logging the discrepancy in the secondary log. Hand sanitizer shortage of 1 bottle, cause unknown. I didn't mention the counting. I didn't mention the feeling of wrongness. I just recorded the facts as I understood them, as I was allowed to. When I walked back out into the main inspection area, the fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the silence more oppressive. I glanced at the interior observation window. It was still covered, thankfully. I hadn't forgotten that rule. But even as I reassured myself, I noticed something new. A faint discoloration on the floor near the counter where I'd been counting. A small, circular stain. It was almost invisible. But I saw it. And it smelled faintly of cherries. I didn't whistle. The air felt thick, and I knew with growing dread that whatever had taken that bottle hadn't just disappeared. It had left something behind. I was reshelving the confiscated items, mostly tourist junk, Swiss Army knives, oversized bottles of liquor, a truly alarming number of decorative gourds. People tried to bring anything across that border, anything at all. It was tedious, but it was something to do, something to occupy my hands and my mind. I'd started whistling again, a tuneless little thing, and didn't really notice I was doing it until I realized the break room was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I stopped, felt foolish. The gourds were particularly annoying. They were all different shapes and sizes, and none of them particularly good. The kind of thing your aunt makes and you're obligated to display for a week. I set the last one on the shelf, then started on the paperwork. Mostly customs declarations, manifests, that sort of thing. Routine. It was good to have routine. It meant things were normal. I was reviewing the log from the previous shift, just making sure everything was accounted for. Harvey had been on duty. A meticulous man, Harvey. Everything always in its place, everything properly documented, except there was a correction. Page 17, a handwritten note, scrawled over an earlier entry. It read, Vehicle Inspection, Unit 734. Cleared. Correction. Unit 734. Delayed due to mechanical issue. The ink was slightly different, darker than Harvey's usual blue, and underneath, if you held the page just right to the light, you could almost make out the original entry. Faint lines ghosted beneath the correction. I squinted, trying to decipher the faded script. It looked like a name and a time, but I couldn't quite make it out. Then I remembered something. A line from the orientation manual. Something about altered entries. About not looking too closely. Something about erasure. I couldn't recall the exact wording, just the sense of warning, a strong, insistent prohibition. Probably Harvey just made a mistake, rewrote something, no big deal. People made errors. It was late. He was tired. I was letting my imagination run wild again, fueled by the missing hand sanitizer and the cherry smell. It was just a clerical error. I held the page up to the light again, determined to see what had been written underneath. I needed to know. I needed to confirm it was nothing. The faint lines swam before my eyes. I could almost make out the first name Cleo, and a time 1:17 a.m. But as I focused harder, a wave of dizziness washed over me. A tightness gripped my chest, worse than before. The air felt thin, and the scent of disinfectant seemed to intensify, almost choking me. I quickly lowered the page. The rule. The stupid, unsettling rule: don't attempt to read the original, don't ask who wrote it. It wasn't a command, exactly. More like a plea, a desperate warning, and I'd almost broken it. I'd almost reopened something that was meant to stay closed. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. This was absurd. I was obsessing over a minor discrepancy in a logbook. I had a job to do. I needed to focus. I set the logbook down on the counter and turned my attention back to the confiscated items. There was a pile of electronics that needed cataloging. Digital cameras, cell phones, a few tablets. All seized from people trying to avoid import duties. I started with the cameras, carefully examining each one, noting the make, model, and serial number. I reached for the next camera, a small silver digital camera with a cracked screen. But it wasn't there. I distinctly remembered placing it on the pile. I'd even made a mental note of the cracked screen. I scanned the entire area, checking under the shelves, behind the boxes. Nothing. It had vanished, just like the hand sanitizer. A cold dread settled over me. This wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. Something was happening, something deliberate, and it was connected to the logbook, to the erased entry, to the rule I'd almost broken. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But the room was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed, the refrigerator buzzed. Everything was perfectly, disturbingly normal. I went back to the logbook, determined to ignore the missing camera, to pretend it hadn't happened, to focus on the mundane, but I couldn't. My eyes kept returning to page 17, to the corrected entry, to the faint ghost of writing beneath the ink. I needed to know what had been there. I needed to understand what was going on, but I couldn't. I wasn't allowed to. I closed the logbook with a snap, the sound echoing in the quiet room. I had a shift to finish. I needed to get through the night. I needed to protect Ren and Cal. I needed to hold on to this job, to keep the house. I looked at the clock. 2:53 a.m. I had less than 5 hours until my relief arrived. I started reshelving the confiscated items, slowly, methodically, trying to block out the nagging feeling that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. The scent of cherries was still there, faint but persistent. It seemed to be coming from the logbook. And I knew, with a growing sense of helplessness, that whatever had taken the camera hadn't just disappeared. It had taken something else too, something I wouldn't realize was missing until it was far too late. It had taken my peace of mind. The drive home was gray. Not raining, just gray. The kind of gray that settles over everything in November, making the fields look like old photographs. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there, just the empty highway stretching behind me, the taillights of a semi disappearing over a rise, probably just exhaustion, I thought. My eyes playing tricks on me. It had been a long night, a very long night. I hadn't told Helen anything about the missing camera, or the logbook, or the feeling of being watched. What was I going to say? Honey, I think the border station is haunted. She'd have me committed, and honestly, even saying it out loud sounded ridiculous. I blamed the missing camera on a misplaced item, a simple inventory error. Said I'd probably just put it down somewhere else and forgotten. She bought it. She always did. She was tired too. Still recovering, really. Every cold felt like a relapse. The house smelled like cinnamon when I walked in. Helen must have been baking. Ren and Cal were already asleep. I hung my jacket up, careful to avoid brushing it against anything else. It was a stupid habit, I knew, a leftover from that night. But the thought of transferring something felt unsettling. It wasn't logical. It was just a feeling, a twitch. I'd started double bagging my lunch too. Separate compartments for everything, just in case. I went to the kitchen and found Helen at the counter, icing cookies. She looked up and smiled, a tired smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Long night?" she asked. "The usual," I said. "Quiet, too quiet, maybe." I immediately regretted saying that. It sounded paranoid. She didn't comment, just handed me a cookie. "Sugar will help." I ate the cookie, forcing myself to focus on the sweetness, the texture of the icing. It was good, really good. But even as I chewed, I noticed something. A faint, almost imperceptible scent underneath the cinnamon. Something familiar. It took me a moment to place it. Cherries. It wasn't strong, barely there, but it was enough to make my stomach clench. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore it. It was probably just a coincidence. The bakery down the street used cherry flavoring. Maybe it had drifted in through the vents. It had to be. I helped Helen finish the cookies, then we went to bed. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to Helen's even breathing. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept replaying the night in my head, trying to make sense of it, trying to find a rational explanation, but there wasn't one. Not really. I woke up before dawn, feeling more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. I got up and made coffee, then sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The sky was starting to lighten, a pale, watery blue. I checked my phone, a notification. The job posting was already up. Overnight inspection officer, same pay, same hours, same everything. I scrolled through the description, my eyes scanning the list of requirements. It was almost exactly the same as the posting I'd answered months ago. The same vague language, the same emphasis on attention to detail and adherence to protocol. And then, near the bottom, a single sentence that stopped me cold. Successful applicant must be comfortable working independently in a remote location. I closed my eyes. I could almost smell the disinfectant, the cherries. I could almost hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. I got up and started making breakfast for the kids. Scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice, routine, normal. Later, while I was shaving, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I hadn't realized how much weight I'd lost. My eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles, and I noticed something else. I was whistling, a tuneless, nervous whistle, a habit I hadn't realized I'd picked up again. It was the same tune my father used to whistle when he was worried about something, or trying to pretend he wasn't. This morning, while unloading groceries, the scent hit me again. Not the cinnamon, not the cleaning products, cherries, coming from the bag of apples. I didn't even buy cherries. I just stood there, holding the bag, the scent filling my nostrils. I didn't say anything to Helen, I just put the apples away.